Hola, necesitas sacar el paquete de gramática porque hoy vas a tomar apuntes sobre el pretérito y el imperfecto. So you guys learned about preterite versus imperfect last year in Spanish 2, and then you ended up doing that really awesome book project that I know you loved. And today what we're going to be doing is we are going to be reviewing preterite versus imperfect, when you use the preterite and when you should use the imperfect and when you should use them together. Now let's recall what the preterite is like in English first. In English, the preterite, an example would be Pedro ate. And then an imperfect example would be Pedro used to eat or Pedro was eating. So we definitely change how we talk in English depending on the situation in the past, and we are going to use either the preterite or the imperfect depending on the situation we want to describe. Let's review our preterite AR endings first. We have a, aste, o, amos, and aron. And then our preterite ER-IR endings, I, iste, io, imos, y, ieron. So, last year in Spanish 2, you learned that you are going to be using the preterite tense when you have an action that had a specific beginning and ending. You'll be using the preterite tense if the action started and ended at a definite time. For example, a war begins at a definite time. Somebody was president during a definite time period. We're going to expand upon that, and this year in Spanish 3, we are going to say that we use the preterite tense to describe an action or a series of actions completed in the past. So when I'm telling somebody what I did yesterday, and I'm like, I went home, I did my homework, I went to soccer practice, I ate dinner, I went to sleep. A series of actions, we're going to need to use the preterite. For example, aquel día Pedro fue a la playa y jugó al voleibol. That day, Pedro went to the beach and played volleyball. This sentence is a great example of the use of the preterite because we are talking about a specific day and the activities that happened on that specific day. Let's go ahead and review our imperfect AR endings really quick that we learned in this chapter. Yo, aba, tú, abas, él, ella, usted, aba, nosotros, nosotras, habamos, y ellos, ellas, ustedes, haban. And our imperfect ER-IR endings, yo, ella, tú, ellas, él, ella, usted, ella, nosotros, nosotras, íamos, y ellos, ellas, ustedes, ian. So remember, my imperfect endings are my abas and my ians. And we do have 3 irregular verbs in the imperfect. I definitely am not going to show you all the irregular verbs we have in the preterite tense because that would take way too long. But just to review really quick, our 3 irregulars in the imperfect, we have ir, ser, and ver. Those are going to be our 3 irregulars in the imperfect. Last year in Spanish 2, you learned that you are going to use the imperfect to talk about past actions without saying when they began or ended. For example, when you want to say the warriors were not afraid of the enemy, you're going to say los guerreros no tenían miedo del enemigo. We are not sure when this lack of fear began or ended. El ejército peleaba valientemente. We don't know when the army started fighting bravely and when they stopped. So there is no specific beginning or ending. We're going to expand upon that this year in Spanish 3 and say that we are going to use the imperfect tense for ongoing actions or states of being in the past without focusing on their beginning or end. We are always going to use the imperfect to say what time it was or what the weather was like in the past. Elena siempre iba a la playa cuando hacía buen tiempo. Elena always used to go to the beach when the weather was nice. A lot of times you can think of using the imperfect tense as setting the scene and describing what was happening. For instance, the weather, the time, what people were wearing, what people were doing, what was going on. Setting the scene is a great way to remember when to use the imperfect tense. We also are going to be using both tenses together sometimes in sentences. Last year in Spanish 2, you learned that you were going to use the preterite and the imperfect together when you want to talk about two overlapping events. You're going to be using the preterite for the action that occurred, and you're going to be using the imperfect for what was going on at the time. For example, when the war ended, cuando la guerra terminó, that was my action that occurred, the war ending. Santa Anna era presidente de Mexico. Santa Anna was. We are now going to expand upon this idea in Spanish 3. We know that we definitely can and will often use the imperfect and preterite in the same sentence. We're going to be using the imperfect to tell us what was going on in the background, and we're going to be using the preterite for the interrupting action or main event. Yo nadaba cuando Pedro llegó a la playa. I was swimming when Pedro arrived at the beach. So, what was going on in the background? I was swimming. What was the interrupting action or main event? Pedro's arrival, which is why I put that in the preterite tense. So, there are lots of legends about the origin of fire. We are going to be reading a Mexican legend that explains the origin of fire and why the tail of a possum is bare. This legend comes from a northern region of Mexico, Oaxaca, and it is told between the Mazateca people. Una leyenda mazateca, el fuego y el tlacuache. Hace muchos siglos, en el principio de los tiempos, las personas no conocían el fuego. Un día, una piedra en llamas se cayó de una estrella. Todos tenían miedo de acercarse, pero una mujer vieja se acercó y se llevó el fuego para su casa en una rama seca. Luego, la piedra se apagó y los mazatecas se fueron a sus casas. Pasaban los días y las personas que vivían cerca de la mujer vieja veían que el fuego era bueno y útil. La mujer lo usaba para cocinar la comida y para dar luz y calor. Pero ella no era muy simpática y no le gustaba compartir. Cuando los mazatecas le pedían un poco de fuego, siempre les decía que no. Un día llegó un tlacuache inteligente y les dijo a los mazatecas que él podía traerles el fuego. Los mazatecas pensaban que eso era imposible. Si ellos no lo podían hacer, ¿cómo lo iba a hacer ese pequeño animal? Pero el tlacuache insistió en que él lo podía hacer y que les iba a dar el fuego a todos. El tlacuache fue una noche a la casa de la vieja y vio que ella descansaba delante de un gran fuego. Buenas tardes, señora, dijo el tlacuache. ¡Ay, qué frío hace! Con su permiso, me gustaría estar un rato al lado del fuego. La vieja sabía que se hacía un frío terrible y le permitió al tlacuache acercarse al fuego. En ese momento, el tlacuache puso su cola directamente en el fuego y luego salió corriendo de la casa con la cola en llamas para darle el fuego a todas las personas de la región. Y por eso que los tlacuaches tienen las colas peladas. So you probably didn't understand the entire legend word for word, but hopefully you are going to be able to come to class tomorrow and tell me why possums don't have hair on their tails. Now, you have some questions that you're going to be answering on this leyenda, but before we answer those, I am going to go through and talk about all the different verbs. I am going to be drawing a red square around the imperfect verbs. And I'm going to be underlining in blue the preterite verbs. You're going to be filling out a chart telling me why a verb is an imperfect or why it is in the preterite tense. We will be going over this tomorrow in class, in addition to going over the answers of why possums don't have hair on their tails and the answers to the comprendiste section that you need to fill out. Conocían. Se cayó, tenían, se acercó, se llevó, se apagó, se fueron, pasaban, vivían, veían, era, usaba, era, le gustaba, le pedían, les decía, llegó, dijo, podía, pensaban, era, podían, iba, insistió, podía, iba, fue, vio, descansaba, dijo, sabía, hacía, permitió, puso, salió. So, again, the imperfect verbs are in red squares and the preterite verbs are underlined in blue. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and answer these comprendiste questions about the leyenda that we just went over together. Número 1, ¿quiénes son los mazatecas? Número 2, ¿quería la mujer vieja darles fuego a los otros? ¿Por qué? ¿Para qué usaba el fuego? Número 3, ¿cómo pudo entrar el tlacuache a la casa de la vieja? ¿Qué le dijo? Y número 4, ¿por qué tienen los tlacuaches las colas sin pelo? I also want you to think if you know any legends, specifically legends from Spanish-speaking countries.